I understand it. When the times are changing, people get scared of things rearranging. But even history shifts when told by more voices, and not just one kind of person has all the choices. So here we are, there's no turning back. The cost that was paid for all that we have. A new era dawns as another one dies out. But today, the woman still cries out. When God imagined me, the Trinity was in harmony. I was no afterthought, no oversight, no spare rib, and no red light. When God imagined me, the gathering, infinity, was still gathering.
We lost our sound there halfway through, mysteriously, but our words still rang. We can hear that poem, this different imagination of how those of us who identify as female or feminine would be imagined in the heart of God. So when I was a new preacher, my mentor pastor from the church down the road, we thought it would be a good idea to do a pulpit swap right around Stewardship Sunday time. It would be a way for us to support one another, to have our congregations hear a different voice, and to maybe tackle this sometimes tricky topic in a different way. Ooh, we're having there's something in the speakers. And so when we were thinking about this Sunday, these 2 Sundays where we would swap pulpits, but both be at each other's service. Goodness. Yeah.
That microphone was on red light.
Ah, we're dying.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm just have to project. Hello? I'll just talk loud. How about that? Okay. So when we were discussing those Sundays about what we would do, what the service would be, how we would interact, the idea of vestments came up, right? The idea of what would we wear when we were at one another's congregation? And my colleague who, as you can tell from the story, is male. My colleague, this works now. Okay, that's right. So my male colleague, he says something like, oh, you know, I don't like to wear those vestments. I don't even wear a clergy collar, you know, I just like to keep it casual, not so high church or whatnot. And he says, you know what, they don't even call me pastor sometimes. I just let them call me Rick. I'm like, well, that's nice, you know. And then I explained to him as a 27-year-old female clergy, how at that point in my career, I actually preferred to vest, to wear the white awl, which represented putting on Christ, and the stole, which represented servanthood. And I like to wear it because it covered me up. Right? I wanted to be clear that my leadership as a young female was not about my body or what I chose to wear on any given Sunday. They all symbolized who I wanted to be perceived as a spiritual leader. At the same time, it muted my identity. And maybe you wouldn't be surprised to know how many comments I still got about my shoes or my earrings or my hairstyle, right? After preaching one of the best sermons I think I preached in years, at the door, one of the ushers said to me, he's like, Pastor Sarah, we just really appreciate how you always look so nice. Right? And don't get me started on being pregnant and in the pulpit, or the mental calculations that would go in for so many years into what I would wear in my Sunday morning attire. Do I wear the heels or the dangly earrings, or my hair up or down? Is this too tight? Does it distract, right? Until I reached a certain point, Leonard, until I reached a certain point, I think it was in my mid-30s, when I was rediscovering feminist and womanist theologians from my seminary career, I decided, you know what, screw it. Whatever makes me feel good, right, is what I need to wear, you know? What makes me a good pastor is being me, and I am a pastor with a female body, right? And so I just dressed how I felt confident and happy. And if someone interprets me in a certain way, or they can't hear the gospel because of what I'm wearing, well, that's between them and the patriarchy. So this week, this topic feels vulnerable to me for a few reasons, right? Vulnerable today, I think, because we're in 3 dimensions, right? So it's like not just like face up that we're talking about femininity, but like whole body, right? This topic is also personal as it touches on my own gender and vocational identity. But as I've grown to understand, all of us, no matter where we fall on the gender spectrum, are enriched when our images for the divine are expanded. And so what's at risk here? When someone is saying something about God, they're saying something about themselves. Or so said my seminary professor, Dr. Pete Perot. In Islam, there is a practice of, with beads, praying through the 99 names for Allah. And in Hebrew and Christian scriptures, they similarly attest to this multiplicity in designations for the divine. However, throughout the Abrahamic traditions, it is masculine names for God, which have shown up almost exclusively in liturgy, catechesis, and theology. The proper name argument in Christianity for the use of this language asserts that God, in Jesus, has told us how God wants to be called Father, and this is the most proper way to address God. All replacements for this traditional triune name disrupts the faith's self-identity at the church's earliest point by this line of reasoning, right? Yet to say the name of God is to risk saying something inaccurate about God and potentially harmful towards yourselves and others. As feminist theologian Elizabeth Johnson has said time and time again, the symbol of God functions, meaning that the words or symbols we use for God have power over the individual and indeed entire religious systems and world orders. Paul Tillich would say that symbols are double-edged swords as they are directed toward the infinite, which they symbolize, and toward the finite, through which they symbolize. And it's Mary Daly who said so succinctly, if God is male, then male is God. Or, as the little girl's letter to the divine said, dear God, are boys better than girls? I know you are one, but try to be fair. In every religion, the ultimate reality, be that called Allah or Yahweh, God or Brahman, is said to be beyond all things limited. And that would include a gender identity or expression. And it's clear that if there is a universal spirit, it wouldn't have a reproductive system, right? Or body parts. And yet here we are. And the reality is that language shapes reality. It shapes who has the power, who gets to be up front, make the doctrine, establish laws. And this has been a practice, something that we've known, the co-opting of religious symbols for political ends. This has been around since probably hunter-gatherers organized themselves into agrarian societies, and agrarians tried to make city-states, right? But as Sonia Renee Taylor reminds us, systems do not maintain themselves, right? Every structure in every society is upheld by the active and passive assistance of other human beings. First, I think it must be said that patriarchy and its underlying values are not confined to religions of the book, nor do they always rest on the God concept. Buddha did establish an order for nuns in his lifetime, one which persisted after his death. But as Stephen Prothero points out, according to tradition, Buddha was reluctant to admit women into the Sangha and had to be persuaded by his close friend Ananda and his aunt to do so. And he made nuns subservient to monks. Even the most junior monk would be considered senior to the most senior nun, and nuns followed additional rules. Right? Buddha was known to have said that you should not confuse the finger for the moon. As in, the moon is what we're really interested in, and the finger just points. Buddha may have been referring this to the true mind, being the moon, and teachings are that which point to it. But I think this metaphor also works for any of our attempts to name the divine, right? We know that all designations are metaphors pointing towards a divine reality, fingers not to be confused with the moon. And none alone or even all taken together can exhaust the reality of the divine mystery. So that said, if we are going to attribute any sort of gendering to the ultimate reality, which if not personal, can be too abstract for many to relate to, I would suggest that we might do well to load up on feminine images at this point in time. Why? Well, as my Old Testament professor, who kind of looked like Moses himself, would say, the pendulum is way swung over here, right? And we do this, we load up on feminine images, refer to the divine as she, so that we might swing it back, maybe ending up somewhere in the middle, and then even understanding that the divine has to transcend all categorical thinking in the end, right? So what images of a feminine divine can we think about today? So Hinduism. Hinduism has historically not been shy of the feminine divine, giving us goddesses aplenty to love and learn from. Out of the three most often worshipped Hindu gods, two of them are portrayed as feminine or having unextractable feminine energies. So here we see Shiva, who's often represented by the lingam, is known as both, terrifying and auspicious, destructive and creative. But no matter how he is manifest, this god has no power apart from the feminine principle of Shakti, which means power or energy. Without Shakti, it is said, Shiva is Shava, or a corpse. Then we have Devi. Devi is a goddess, and she has two types of manifestations. She's portrayed both as a goddess of the tooth and a goddess of the breast. Those goddesses of the tooth, they are violent and wild and independent, like Durga or Kali here, who are terrifying, but they use that power to destroy evil. Goddesses of the breast, on the other hand, are nurturing and gentle, joined to their husbands, such as Parvati. And the fidelity of those goddesses are an example of devotion that believers seek to emulate in their own fidelity to their Ishtadevata, or their god of their choosing. We turn to Hebrew scriptures, where we see feminine imagery used to describe God in a variety of ways. In the Old Testament, or in the Jewish scriptures, we see God described as a woman in labor, who gasps and pants and cries out as contractions begin. We see God described as a nurturing mother, right? In these verses from Isaiah, even thinking of your soul being contented like a weaned child on their mother's breast. God is portrayed as a midwife who guides the baby as it comes out of its mother. God is portrayed as a mother eagle who shares or teaches their eaglets to fly. And I like this one. God is portrayed as a grandmother who shares traditions and family secrets with her grandchildren. And then there's Lady Wisdom. Wisdom is personified as a woman in Proverbs, Job, Sirach, and Wisdom of Solomon. Now, wisdom is a feminine noun in Hebrew, chokmah, as it also is in Greek, Sophia, which you can see written at the bottom of this statue. But the personification of wisdom in the Hebrew Bible is more than merely grammatical. Listen to how wisdom is described in the book, The Wisdom of Solomon. It might be small, so I'll read it. It says, there is in her a spirit that is intelligent, holy, unique, manifold, subtle, mobile, clear, unpolluted, distinct, invulnerable, loving the good, keen, irresistible. Skipping down, for wisdom is more mobile than any motion. Because of her pureness, she pervades and penetrates all things. Although she is but one, she can do all things, and while remaining in herself, she renews all things. In every generation, she passes into holy souls and makes them friends of God and prophets. Wisdom, Lady Wisdom, where has she been all these years in preaching and in how we teach? Words actually to describe Jesus in the New Testament, especially in John's Gospel, echo wisdom. We find this interesting passage in the book of Matthew that says, look, they're talking about Jesus. They're saying, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds, it says, right? And some feminist theologians will see in that, right, that Jesus, the Logos of God, is actually a manifestation of Lady Wisdom herself, right? Of course, much can be said about Mary. And it's interesting that Christians actually have less to say than Muslims. In the Islamic tradition, in the Quran, Mary gets an entire sutra. She doesn't get like half that in Christian scriptures. But whether it is the manifestation we see in the Virgen de Guadalupe in Mexico, or it is it being venerated as a saint around the Catholic world, the divine feminine has often been seen embodied in Mary, you know, in what would otherwise be a pretty patriarchal theology and church structure, right? And my own reading of Mary from Christian scripture has never really been as this meek woman decked out in blue. Rather, if you really read her and read like the Song of Mary in Luke, you see there a courageous follower of God who walks this risky and radical path of trust, who advocated for the least of these and never left her son's side. I'm guessing she was a good and wise mother. And I wonder how many words that came out of her mouth found their way onto Jesus' lips. Because who doesn't end up sounding like their parents at some point in our lives, right? Right? So think about Jesus, you think about his mother, who was always, always, always with him. And so when we listen to how Jesus describes God, he consistently uses feminine images to describe the reality of the kingdom and the reality of God. With Nicodemus, he describes coming to know God as getting birthed by the Spirit. Okay, you must be born again, right? Nobody's born just like that, just pop into existence. Birth is messy and it happens through a woman, right? Nicodemus, when he's talking to Jesus, Jesus says you must be born again in the Spirit, right? To get birthed by God. Jesus describes God as a homemaker looking for a lost coin, a baker woman who takes yeast and mixes it with flour to make bread, like a mother hen who gathers her chicks under her wings. And then if we look at his actions, Jesus not only associated with women, but he learned from them, he lifted them up, and he promoted egalitarianism and friendship amongst his disciples. So equality, or this act of balancing of gender roles, is seen in other traditions. I think of it back into Buddhism, particularly in Mahayana Buddhism, and the concept of the Bodhisattva. A Bodhisattva is a being who embodies compassion, who, though they have reached a nirvanic state, renounce it in order to remain in the world, to alleviate the suffering of others, and to promote the awakening of other beings. This Bodhisattva that you see on your screen, whose name I will not attempt to pronounce, is known as a Bodhisattva of Compassion. Now, in India, this Bodhisattva is male. In China, this same Bodhisattva is depicted as female and called Guanyin, a goddess of mercy akin to the Virgin Mary. Some sources leave this Bodhisattva androgynous. And in Tibet, there's a male and female Bodhisattva of Compassion who cannot be separated from one another. Chenzerig is the male, and the female aspect is called Tara, who I think I would like, because listen to this. Tara, when she was alive, monks asked her, why hadn't she used the merit she had accumulated to be reborn in her next life as a man? And Tara had no interest in this sort of magic. She said this, for all my lifetimes along the path, I vow to be born as a woman. And in my final lifetime, when I attain Buddhahood, I will be a woman, she said. In my office, I have this little statue. I honestly don't know when I acquired it, where it came from. I would have brought it, but it's even a little broken right now. It's that old. And I've always looked at it and thought of it as kind of a prayer or kind of a reminder, because on the plaque, it's a mirror behind this little statue, and it says, Dear God, am I a reflection of you? What's at stake ultimately in naming the divine, whether that be feminine or masculine or non-binary? For me, I answer that from my own perspective. I think we want those who identify as girls to be able to say, yes, I am a vessel of the divine. I am made in the image of God. And for those who identify as little boys to know that spirituality in a man does not require the denial of the feminine. And maybe for those who identify as women, embracing the feminine divine within them can ground them in a deeper sense of self-worth and empowerment. And for those who identify as men, exploring the feminine divine might liberate them from a patriarchal God who didn't want to hear their vulnerabilities or their prayers. And for all of us, the hope would be not to get stuck, I think, ultimately in this binary, especially when it comes to something quite so ineffable ultimately as the divine. So I wonder, do you agree that the symbol of God speaks? Have you seen that in action in your own life? And what image of the divine speaks to you most of late? I look forward to hearing about that after the service. Amen.